Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks for holding this hearing. And I want to thank the Chairwoman for being here also and taking the time. I want to raise some questions about how the Fed communicates with the general public, specifically their policies, and specifically how you communicate those. Let me give you an example here, and it led up to the increase of the interest rates back in December. You had people from the Feds, like the head of the San Francisco Fed, saying that they were pretty hawkish, that interest rates were going to be increased and that those increases were coming, and the market reacted to it. Then there were others, like the head of the Chicago Fed, calling for rates to stay near zero, and the markets reacted to it. Then we had some Fed officials implying that any rate increases would be data-driven, and the markets responded to that. And then we had some saying there was no formula. Even today, we seem to have a new person each day giving their thoughts about future rates. Now, I don't have a problem with broad questions and variety of viewpoints and coming from Fed members, but what it's causing, though, is confusion and instability in the markets today every time someone has something to say, feeling like they got to walk in front of a mic and make a comment. My question to you is, do you think there's a problem here? And how these markets are reflecting every time one of these Fed members opens their mouth by hundreds of points. And in general, I'm not sure most of them know what they're talking about.
So I would say that Congress purposely created a system with a large monetary policy making committee where there would be a diversity of views so that we did not fall into a groupthink type of mentality. And we do have, at the moment, 17 members who come to the table with a range of views.
So you're comfortable where we are today?
We have guidelines for communications because it is important to explain to the public what our policy is about.
Can I see a copy of that guideline?
Yes,
sure like
I'd be glad to.
Okay,
First of all, the guideline says that everyone shares a joint objective of explaining the committee's decisions. They can explain their own views, but should be explaining that they are not speaking for the committee, that they are speaking for themselves. And the person who speaks for the committee
and it clearly
is the chair.
Carries water. You raised rates on December 16th by 1/4 of a point. At that time, the markets closed. The S&P 500 closed at 2,073. Yesterday, it closed at 1851, and I think it's down another 34, 35 plus points today. Do you feel that you or the Feds are responsible for this decline?
Well, the immediate market response, and for a number of weeks, to the Fed decision was quite tranquil. It was a decision that I believe had been well communicated and was expected, and there was very little market reaction. Around the turn of the year, we began to see more volatility in financial markets. Some of the precipitating factors seemed to be the movement in Chinese currency and the downward move in oil prices. I think those things have been the drivers, and they've been associated with broader fears that have developed in the market about the potential for weakening global growth with spillovers to inflation. So I don't think it's mainly our policy.
Yeah, let's go back to oil prices again. So since it's not your policies that are causing the market decline. You told us last year here in this meeting that drop in oil prices was a good thing for the economy and for the consumer. That's what you said a year ago. And yet since then, we've seen thousands of jobs lost. We see oil companies in bankruptcy and consumers that are not spending their gas savings. Do you still feel the same way about oil prices?
Well, clearly declining oil prices have had some negative consequences. There have been sharp job cuts and cutback in drilling activity and capital spending.
And that's been... Do you think you made a mistake a year ago when you said it would be good for the economy and good for the consumers?
On balance, I would say it's still true for the United States we're a net importer of oil in spite of our large production, and the gains to households from lower oil prices, they average about $1,000 per household. Now, whether they spend or don't spend those gains, those are substantial gains. From the standpoint of growth, what's been dominant so far, I would say, is the negative consequences on spending from
Okay.
the cutback in drilling activity.
Let me get your feeling on a question. Do you think that banks here in America are overregulated or underregulated?
I recognize that regulatory burden is a significant issue for many banks, and it's something we will do our very best and have been working to mitigate, particularly for community banks that are vital to the health of their communities. But I do think for the larger banks that whose failure would have systemic consequences, it's critically important to make sure that they hold more capital, liquidity, or held to higher standards to address the threats that they pose to the financial stability of our country and the global economy.
So is it fair for me to say that you believe smaller banks are overregulated, large banks are underregulated?
I don't want to say as a blanket matter that community banks are overregulated. What I do think is that we need to do everything in our power to look for ways to simplify and control regulatory burdens for them.
One more question.
Go ahead.
One more question. Thank you for being
You got to vote, but go ahead.
flexible.
Let him ask the question.
One more question. In a recent Wall Street Journal survey, the odds of a recession in the next 12 months have climbed to 21%, and that's double what it was a year ago. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I mentioned in my testimony and my answers this morning, we have seen global economic and financial developments that may well affect the U.S. outlook. Financial conditions have tightened, and that can have consequences for the outlook. I think it's premature at this point to decide exactly what the consequences of those shocks will be, and it depends in part on whether they persist. And that's something we will be looking at closely going forward. We are looking at closely.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much for being here. And Mr. Chairman,